Great. Welcome, everyone. We have an amazing session today. Thank you for joining us. I want to introduce you all to Professor Francesco Izzo. Francesco, welcome, and thank you very much for this amazing session.
No, thank you for inviting me. We'll see whether it's amazing.
It will be. So just a couple of notes. The session will be an hour long. We will have a session. The session will be led by Francesco. It will last around between 45 to 50 minutes, and leaving the final 10 minutes for questions. So just pop the questions in the chat or raise your hand at the end of the session. So before we begin, I'll give you a short introduction, Francesco, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So Professore Francesco Izzo is a professor of music and postgraduate admission tutor in music at the University of Southampton. His research focuses on 19th century opera, concentrating in particular on the works of Giuseppe Verdi. He currently serves as co-director of the American Institute for Verdi Studies and as general editor of The Works of Giuseppe Verdi, a series co-published by Ricordi and the University of Chicago Press that will make available all of Verdi's works in complete and textual accurate readings. His work on opera and critical editions involves a significant amount of presentations to general audiences, media appearances, and consulting with opera companies. He collaborates regularly with the companies including the Welsh National Opera, the Royal Opera House, the leading opera houses of Bilbao, Madrid, München, Napoli, Palermo, and Roma, the Donizetti, Kleinburg, and Salzburg festivals, among other leading opera houses and festivals. He has had the pleasure of working and consulting with conductors such as Roberto Abbado and singers including Juan Diego Flores and Lisette Oropesa. He also delivers workshops and seminars on vocal style and operatic performance, working with talented young artists at the Juilliard School in New York, the Accademia Verdiana in Parma, and the Conservatorio della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano, among many other activities. So Francesco, welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefano, for this introduction. I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. I hope you can all see me well and hear me well. I'm not in the location where I had planned to be this afternoon, so bear with me if there are any slight technical glitches, and unfortunately I will not be able to play the piano as I had meant to do to demonstrate a few passages, but I trust we'll have a good time. If you would like to type messages and type comments as we go along, please feel free to do that. I will leave Stefano Boccacci to moderate and to allow intervention as he deems appropriate, and then I will try to leave a few minutes at the end for comments and questions. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to see whether I can now share that. Where did it go? La, 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 la. This must be the one. Share. Of course, we tried this just a moment ago. And it worked perfectly, and now it's not working that well, but now it will, I'm sure. Yes, okay, much better. Okay, so I trust you can now see my screen with the title of our chat today, which is going to be about performance practice in 19th century Italian opera. This is, of course, a huge subject, and we are going to narrow it down considerably. What I want to concentrate on is a period that we sometimes refer to as bel canto opera, basically ranging from Rossini to Bellini, Donizetti, and Verdi. Most of my examples will be from Rossini, but I've chosen them trusting and hoping that they will be meaningful in a broader sense, and that the aspects of performance practice that we discuss will be applicable to other composers and other works, definitely. Let me now advance to the next slide. I've just mentioned composers. I've mentioned Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, and Verdi, and these are composers that opera lovers, connoisseurs, professionals tend to love dearly, and so that's a starting point. But I'd like to complicate the picture a little bit, because as we talk about performance practice, we must remember that opera is not just about composers. There are, of course, librettists who provide the text, the words, the poetry. And there are singers, very important for us. I know that many of you out there who are joining this presentation are singers, but singers will be very important for what we have to say about ornamentation this evening. So we must think of this group of personae, this group of people who really contribute to bringing opera to life in a creative sense. In the reality of early and mid-19th century Italy, the operatic life revolved around other characters and individuals and figures. And we should bear in mind at least impresarios who ran opera companies and were responsible for arranging the season program, signing up composers to write new operas, choosing old operas, and so on. Publishers were very much part of the picture and became more important as the century unfolded. For a composer like Verdi, the collaboration with his key publisher Ricordi in Milan was absolutely pivotal. I'm also mentioning censors. We must remember that when operas were composed, were created in the 19th century, before the unification of Italy, they were subjected to very significant censorial scrutiny. So these are all factors that we must keep in mind. And when we say Rossini's Il Barbiere di Siviglia, or Donizetti's L'Elisir d'Amore, or Verdi's Rigoletto, we must bear in mind that there is a lot going on beyond the wonderful composers who, so to speak, sat down and wrote the music. And there is another factor that I haven't mentioned yet, but that is really central to what we have to say today. That factor is time. Let's remember that in the 19th century, opera was, in a way, consumer's good, in that there was a constant demand for new works. The success of an opera was determined, especially in the early part of the century, was determined not so much by its longevity, by the number of years during which it remained on stage, but rather by the breadth of its circulation. And no one really in 1816 would have expected that Rossini's Il Barbiere di Siviglia would have become a perennial favorite that we're still listening to more than 200 years after its creation. The expectation was rather than new operas would continue to be produced. And Rossini himself, indeed, after Il Barbiere di Siviglia, went on to write other operas that same year, and the year after, and the year after that. And very often, a new commission came with time pressure. There was the need to deliver a new libretto and a new score and to rehearse it and to bring it to the stage very quickly. How did composers do that? They did that by drawing on a set of conventions that were shared by composers, librettists, and also by the singers, and that were broadly understood by the audience. So let's think for a moment about what those conventions were. In this slide, you can see the title page and then one page from the first edition of the libretto for Rossini's opera Tancredi, an opera seria that really was pivotal in establishing Rossini as the leading composer of the early 19th century. Hugely successful, performed for the first time at La Fenice in Venice, as you can see, in the carnival season of 1813. I don't expect you to know Italian necessarily, and I don't even expect you to be able to read the words in the page of poetry on the right side of the screen. I'm showing this to you to flag out that the poetry for this particular passage, which is Tancredi's entrance aria, near the beginning of Act 1, the moment where Tancredi, the hero, the male protagonist of the opera, arrives on a boat and approaches the shores of Siracusa in Sicily. I'd like to point out that there is a passage here that is now highlighted in blue. That passage is recitative. It is written in a free combination of 11-syllable lines, endecasillabi in Italian, and 7-syllable lines, setenari in Italian. There is no fixed rhyme scheme, although you might notice that the final two lines are rhyming, sfidando il mio destin qualunque sia, meritarti o morir anima mia. But other than that, these are called versi sciolti, which in English can be translated as loose verse. At the bottom of that same page, you can see that the poetry suddenly is indented, okay? There is the hanging indent for the first line, and then we have a stanza consisting of 6 poetic lines. And at this point, what we have is lines of fixed length and that follow a rhyme scheme. Tu che accendi questo core, tu che desti il valor mio, alma, gloria, dolce, amore, which rhymes con core, the most trite rhyme in all of Italian poetry, heart rhyming with love, core and amore. Secondate il bel desio, which rhymes with mio, and then traditore, which rhymes with amore, and so on. These are called versi lirici, and this is the kind of poetry that is set to music in the lyrical sections, which are organized according to regular phrase structures and repetition and so on. If you look at the bottom of the very bottom, the final 3 lines on this page, you will see that the indentation is further increased, and the poetic meter changes. Now we have di tanti palpiti, di tante pene, date mio bene, spero mercé, and we would have to move to the next page to see how it continues. What I'd like to flag out, and the reason I'm showing this page from a printed libretto of 1813 to you, is that the way in which the poetry is laid out already presupposes that the composer will respond by dividing the number, by dividing Tancredi's aria, in this specific case, into different sections. There is a recitative, which is free and through composed and to a certain extent declamatory. Then there is the section that begins with Tu che accendi, which is a slow lyrical section, sometimes referred to as cantabile. And then, when the poetry is indented even further in this example, we have a cabaletta, which is a faster moving conclusive concluding section for the number, and the cabaletta is typically repeated either in full or sometimes in part. So in this hectic world of 19th century Italian opera, where time was of the essence, very much so, composers, librettists, and singers shared conventions that allowed them to prepare poetry, compose music, rehearse it, learn it, and perform it quite rapidly. Okay, and it's very important to understand that this is not to say that things were done in haste, that things were done carelessly. Very often in the past, for a significant part of the early and middle 20th century, Italian opera was regarded as a not very serious business. And part of the reason was this sense that composers worked in a rush, that they were not paying attention to detail, that they were composing quickly, drawing a great deal on repetition, and that moreover, very important, singers had the freedom to introduce their own ornamentation. Singers had the power, so to speak, to abuse the composer's creation and to introduce their own embellishments, cadenzas, variations, ornamentation. All of this must be understood rather as a system. It's not a sign that things were not done properly, so to speak. It is merely a creative and productive system that led to the production and the consumption of a great deal of operatic music. To look at things from another perspective, I've prepared another slide, and if Stefano agrees and is able to, that he will then be able to share this PowerPoint with everyone after we're done. But this is just to give you an outline of the poetic and musical form of typical numbers in early or mid 19th century Italian opera. So in a piece like Tancredi's entrance aria, we have, first of all, an orchestral prelude, which depicts quite effectively the shore and the boat that approaches. Then there is a recitative, and we'll talk about that passage later on. Then what we find is a combination of a primo tempo and or a slow lyrical movement. This is a little bit of a fuzzy area. I'm not going to go into great depth here, but just keep in mind that we get to a first lyrical section, which in the case of Tancredi's entrance aria is a slow lyrical movement, a short, slow cantabile, with an accompaniment in triplets and regular 4-bar phrasing. Then there is usually, not all the time, a middle movement, which is called in Italian a tempo di mezzo, which serves as a connection between the lyrical movement, the slow lyrical movement in this case, and the cabaletta. The Tancredi's entrance aria does not have a tempo di mezzo, but many other numbers from operas by Rossini and Bellini and Donizetti and Verdi and their contemporaries have a tempo di mezzo, okay? So I hope this is clear. Are there any questions, any comments that people would like to raise at this stage?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Hi, Francesco. My name is Cathal.
Hi.
I was just wondering, you talk about the aria and cabaletta tradition being a tradition, but personally, I don't know what came before that, because if it was a tradition, when did this tradition emerge, the aria and cabaletta? Because I'm so used to the 19th century, I don't know really where it emerged from, if it was already a tradition with these guys that you're demonstrating now.
That's a really good question. The poetic and musical forms that I'm describing right now emerge quite rapidly in the early 19th century. If you look at the operas by Mozart, but also those by Paisiello or Cimarosa, just to mention a couple of names of people who came before Rossini, you don't find exactly this kind of model. You will often find a double aria consisting of a slow movement followed by a fast movement. You know, think of, I don't know, Non più di fiori in Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito, for example. That's the first one that comes to mind right now. But the cabaletta as the closing section of a number with the built-in repetition, you know, of the entire lyrical section is very much an early 19th century concept, which then remains important with developments, with modifications for all the way into the second half of the 19th century. I mean, operas such as Verdi's La Forza del Destino and even Aida contain fairly standard cabalettas, very recognizable as such from a formal standpoint. Some people sometimes raise their eyebrows when I say that the very final scene, the very end of Aida, is cabaletta. O terra, addio valle di pianti. But if you look at it from a formal standpoint, it is precisely like the duet for Edgardo and Lucia in Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, which was composed nearly 40 years prior. So there is this consistency in formal procedures from the early 19th century, but you cannot really go much further back than early Rossini. Does this answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Okay, great. So here I've just added another column to the same slide, and you can see that there is this alternation between versi lirici and versi sciolti. And this is just for your reference. We don't need to go much deeper into this than we already have. So I mentioned bel canto earlier on. Now the term bel canto is a broadly used one. In Italian, it means beautiful singing, as many of you will know or realize. There are various discussions of bel canto, scholarly discussions, including some. There is a very influential book by the Italian scholar and voice teacher Rodolfo Celletti entitled Storia del bel canto, or in English, History of bel canto. It was translated and published in Oxford by Clarendon. Celletti argued that bel canto goes basically from the 17th century all the way to Rossini. Today, however, we tend to use the term bel canto to refer to operas by Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti primarily. And personally, I would extend the concept of bel canto also to at least early Verdi, with the inclusion of some of Verdi's middle period operas. So bel canto means beautiful singing, and that, you know, one might argue that in opera we expect singing to be beautiful. Why would you do it otherwise? But it means more than that. It means that there is a focus, a very specific and important focus on the singing voice as a site for expressiveness and virtuosity. You know, bel canto opera, if you want to call it that, is opera where the characterization, the drama, the confrontation and clashes and you know, partnerships between different characters are expressed through singing, through the voice. This is not to say that the orchestra is not important in the operas of Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, and Verdi. Nothing is further from the truth. It is merely to say that, again, there is this primary focus on the singing voice, where it's not just about virtuosity, which is important, but it is also about expressing emotions, dramatic situations, and a story, if you want to call it that. Another very important aspect of bel canto, and it is the one to which we now turn and on which we focus for the remainder of our conversation, is the creative contribution of the singer. I've mentioned before that we say Verdi, we say Rossini, we say Donizetti, and that's all good and well, but that we should bear in mind that the creative process of an opera is a more complicated affair, and that different forces come into play. I will say, and I will argue today, that the singer at the time that these operas were composed played a crucial creative role, gave a crucial creative contribution. I will also argue furthermore that today, as we worry about the performance practice of 19th century Italian opera, we should really pay attention to what singers can contribute and empower them to bring these scores to life in ways that sometimes we accept and explore, and that sometimes we don't take sufficient advantage of. So I'd like to raise three key questions, 3 points, if you want to call them that, about the composition and what we see on the written page of an Italian opera of, say, the early 19th century. It could be Rossini's Tancredi, it could be Bellini's Norma, it could be Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, it could be Verdi's Nabucco or Hernani, or Macbeth, for that matter. And I'm going to talk about letter, intention, and meaning. Letter, to be literal, is what did a composer write? Sometimes we know for sure, sometimes we don't. Scores, manuscript scores in the hands of Rossini or Donizetti or Verdi can be very difficult to read in some ways, but we can sort of figure out, if we have access to an autograph score, we can figure out what the composer wrote, and that's important. We will talk for a moment about critical editions later on. But that's only a starting point. I've already told you that the reality of the opera business at the time was intense, was hectic, to say the least. And so sometimes composers used shorthand writing. They made mistakes, even mistakes. So we cannot stop at the letter. We need to look at intention. What did the composer intend to write? You know, where they mark a repetition, where they write a big fermata, and we might imagine that they meant to write a cadenza, but they didn't for whatever reason. There is that level of intention that must be explored very carefully when we perform Italian opera of the 19th century. Finally, perhaps most importantly, there is the meaning. What does a composer mean when they write a cabaletta and they plan for that cabaletta to be repeated in full? What do they mean when they write on a downbeat 2 consecutive notes that are the same, you know, where you have the same pitch twice? Sometimes the letter, the intention, and the meaning are fairly aligned, but sometimes, actually quite often, letter, intention, and meaning diverge. They function on different levels. And as performers of Italian opera, as singers, as conductors, Stefano was telling me earlier that we have quite a few conductors among you today, we need to think about these 3 levels. We need to not stop at the letter, you know, not stop at the come scritto, as written, because that's misleading, and we need instead to go beyond that and to think about ultimately what composers meant. You know, what is the message, and how do we bring it to life? Drawing on singers' active, creative input, as I mentioned before. So here we turn to ornamentation. It is understood, for good reason, that one of the key aspects in the performance of Italian opera of the early and mid-19th century is vocal ornamentation. It is indeed at the heart of bel canto aesthetics. Rossini's music in particular, but also the music of Bellini and Donizetti, and to a significant extent Verdi, is often richly ornamented. In the music of these composers, we will come across extremely elaborate passages that are vocalized and that are difficult to sing. Think of, some of the most famous arias out there. Rosina's Una voce poco fa, where the slow section is just filled with cadenzas and flourishes, and the cabaletta itself has a melody that grows increasingly complex, but that at the very beginning already contains vocalized material. Io sono docile, right? With those semiquavers or 16th notes, if you're connecting with us from the United States, that don't really add anything in terms of providing musical material to fit the text to, but simply embellish the melody and express Rosina's character and things that she's talking about. So composers do that. Composers write ornamented passages. But furthermore, and crucially, they also plan for singers to add further embellishments. And that's where the creative contribution of the singer becomes particularly evident. If we have a recitative, there will be moments, and we will see some examples in a moment, where the singers will be expected to add something. And if we have a cabaletta, for the second statement in particular, we will expect that it will not be sung in the same way, but that there will be ornaments, that there will be variations introduced by the singers. In the 19th century, the practice of improvising was important, of course. Today, we tend to plan for ornamentation in advance, and there are certain ways in which we can do it, and I'd like to explore those ways and how we can draw on 19th century practice to inform what we do today as singers, as conductors, as vocal coaches, for example. Why ornamentation? Ornamentation is a matter that concerns different areas of the operatic experience. First of all, there is virtuosity, and I always like to stress that virtuosity is not a negative thing. Virtuosity doesn't have to be excessive, doesn't have to be gratuitous, doesn't have to be all about showing off. One of the reasons we love opera, one of the ways in which opera functions as a form of expression, as an art form, is through enjoyment of singing voices doing incredible things. So virtuosity is there, and it should be there, and it should not be questioned. It can be guided. It can be directed in towards certain aims, but it must be kept in mind as one of the pillars of vocal ornamentation in 19th century Italian opera. Then there is variety. For the reasons that I outlined earlier, there is a great deal of repetition in Italian operas of the early and mid-19th century. Repetition that happens at the level of an entire section, for example, a cabaletta, as I've mentioned several times already. But there is also the repetition of a four-bar phrase. And those repetitions typically are intended, or at least designed in such a way as to allow some kind of ornamentation. There are differences, of course, between when the repetition involves singing the same text and when the repetition involves singing new words. But repetition, musical repetition, calls for or at least allows for some kind of ornamentation. Then there is characterization and drama. How do you depict a character? How can you use vocal ornamentation to show that a character is a king, or a warrior, or a lover, or a faithful wife, or a young woman in love? What can you do through ornamentation to characterize the different characters who are part of a story? And how can you tell the story itself. How do you express drama through ornamentation? How do you differentiate between comic and serious, for example? How do you ornament a passage in a highly dramatic situation versus a situation that is playful or sentimental? These are all important questions, and these are all things around which ornamentation revolves. Now that we've talked a little bit about why we ornament and what we can do with ornamentation, let's talk about, in practical terms, about how we can ornament the music of 19th century Italian opera. I'd like to point out that these categories and these concepts and lists that I'm sharing with you are, drawn to a certain extent on 19th century treatises and other sources, but they are pretty much my way of organizing the materials. There are other ways that are perfectly legitimate and effective. So I don't intend to say that this is the Bible and that this is what you need to follow and that there is nothing else or that there is all of this. Okay, these are things that I'd like you to think about, no less, no more. So types of intervention, what can a singer do? One, mechanical substitutions, specifically prosodic appoggiaturas. We will look at examples of these. So this is just to give you a list to start from. If you want to catch a screenshot of this before we go on, you can do that, of course. Puntature, which is basically changes in pitch. So instead of singing a note, you sing a higher note, for example. Diminutions, or diminuzioni in Italian, which is where you replace a long value with a shorter one. So, for example, Rossini writes, Io sono docile. You can easily add further notes, right? Io sono docile. That would be a diminuzione. Cadenzas, where the orchestra stops, and that happens at the end of a cantabile, most notably, but also at points of articulation in the form. When there is a fermata, you may very well find a cadenza or provide one. Then there are interventions that don't really involve changing the notes or adding notes, but that have to do more with expression. Rhythmic changes, such as accelerando, rallentando, or altering the values of a passage, changes in dynamics, and modifications in phrasing. Where do you breathe, for example? Okay, we'll try to think of a few examples of each of these, and I'm going to draw on wonderful material from the 19th century, voice treatises. And here we turn to Manuel Garcia Jr. Manuel Garcia Jr. was the son of Manuel Garcia Sr. He was also the brother of the celebrated prima donna Maria Malibran and the other celebrated prima donna Pauline Viardot Garcia. Manuel Garcia Jr. wrote a singing treatise or manual in the mid-19th century, known as the École de Garcia, and it is divided into two parts. You can find it quite easily in digital form. If you go through IMSLP or other resources, you will be able to download these treatises, and I strongly recommend, if you're serious about singing or conducting this kind of repertoire, that you have a close look at what Garcia has to say, because it is a wonderful insight into that world. It is not to say that you need to do everything that Garcia says. It is to say that you need to understand some of the mechanisms and reasons behind the choices. Here we have a recitative from Assur's Scena in Act 2 of Semiramide. And it is a wonderful example of a prosodic appoggiatura, the mechanical substitution. Whenever you find something that is notated as here, deliro, in reality, what the composer means is for the first of these notes to be changed. Hence, you introduce an appoggiatura on the accented syllable of the line. So not deliro, but deliro. Okay, this is mechanical. It's not something that you need to think about. Do I do it? Do I not do it? I'll be quite blunt on this one. If you don't do prosodic appoggiaturas in this kind of repertoire, you go wrong, at least according to the practices of the time. Composers like Rossini hardly ever write down prosodic appoggiaturas. With people like Bellini and Rossi and Donizetti, and especially Verdi, sometimes they write out the prosodic appoggiatura themselves. Sometimes they don't, and that can be misleading, because then as conductors, as vocal coaches, as singers, we may feel, oh, well, Verdi didn't write it here, but he wrote it 2 bars later, so I'm not going to do it where he didn't write it. That's really erroneous. Simply, Verdi has 2 ways of notating the same musical concept, because it is a transitional phase. So that's prosodic appoggiaturas. Here we have another example from Rossini, and we go back to Tancredi's Scena and Cavatina in Act 1. And we have an example, very elementary example of puntatura. That there is this phrase that goes, comincia il cor a respirarmi in seno. Okay? And in the example taken from Garcia, you can see that the conclusion of this phrase brings the voice up a 5th from the G to the D. So instead of having in seno, we have in seno. And that's a puntatura. Puntaturas can be more complex than this, but at the basic level, this is what they are, merely changing one note for another. Here we have another example of puntature, which is more complex. It's a beautiful example. We go back to Assur's Scena in Semiramide. Assur is about to descend into the grave where Nino, the king of Babylon, that he has killed himself pretty much. And I'm not going to give you a summary of the plot of Semiramide. And here the words say, di Nino nella tomba là si discende. You know, through there one descends into Nino's tomb. And Rossini writes this passage, as you can see, with a number of repeated notes, Nino nella tomba là si discende, which is a descending line in itself, right? C, C, B, A, G. And note, by the way, the prosodic appoggiatura, which is notated as a grace note in this particular case. Garcia here goes a long way towards making the passage more expressive by lowering its conclusion by a whole octave. La si discende. I am not a bass, and I'm not a singer for that matter, so I can do this properly, but if you listen to the great singers such as Samuel Raimi or Michele Pertusi, who have sung the role of Assur, you can imagine what it would sound like through the voice of an accomplished singer. And here Garcia actually writes, les notes graves, lentes et pleines, slow and full. And this idea of descent, that's what I meant about expressing the meaning of the words through ornamentation. It becomes more powerful, more poignant. You may decide that it's not for you. You may decide that it's excessive. But when we talk about going down into a grave, it's kind of a scary concept. It is an intense message, and we might want to bring it to life through the use of vocal ornamentation. Puntature, changing pitches. Well, here we have a wealth of changes in this passage. You can see that in the first couple of bars, there are sort of cadenzas that are added. But we have, oh wait, this is the slide that we looked at before. The comincia ancora a respirare in seno. Sorry, that was a repeat. That's why I was lost for a moment. Diminutions. This is a lovely example that comes from the Garcia manual, which shows what a diminution can be about. We have a little cadential figure. Yum, bum, 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 bum. And Garcia shows us many different ways in which we can ornament that figure. So for example, piaram, param, piri, param, pam, or yum, param, 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 pitata, tita, tita, tata, tita, dam, or tada, tada, tita, tata, tita, dam, and so on. You have them all in here. You have the page number. You can find this example and study it carefully. These are fairly dynamic diminutions, fairly mechanical diminutions, but one can apply the same principle to passages that are not quite as predictable or formulaic. Rhythmic changes. Now we talk about things that are not really written down because they are in the expressive realm. This is one of my favorite examples because it happens all the time. It is an ornament, if you want to call it that, but it is a modification that is introduced by performers that is not justified in what is written in the score, which is not to say it's unjustifiable. It can be perfectly justified, but it is something that should give us pause. This is the cabaletta that Lucia sings in her first aria in Lucia di Lammermoor, Quando rapito in estasi. And we get towards the end of the cabaletta, and I'm talking about the first statement. I'm not talking about the repeat. And what she sings, you don't see this in on this page, but you get the parmi che a lui la canto si schiuda il ciel per me, and then sopranos in the 20th century, in the early 21st century, almost invariably half the tempo. So they sing me pam pam. So for that one bar of music, they slow down very considerably. It is a rhythmic alteration. It is traditional. It is done again almost invariably, but by the great Lucias that I've heard to an overwhelming extent do this. I'd like to point out that it is an alteration. It's not what the composer writes. It may mean what it may express the intention, what the composer intends. It certainly provides for a more emotional and sentimental rendition of this passage. This is actually, it's a fun example for me because it is one of those rare cases where I tell singers, well, instead of doing what is traditional, which is predictable, which we've heard so many times already, why don't you try it in tempo? Schiuda il ciel per me, only the first time. Then when the cabaletta is repeated in full, you will do a number of ornaments, and here you can also use rhythmic freedom. But it's just a lovely example of things that happen routinely. Again, this is a traditional change to the score, and we don't even know that it is a change because it's just the way we are used to hearing it. Dynamics and phrasing. Here we could go very far, and I mentioned 3 Verdi examples, and I will concentrate in particular on Violetta's A forse lui che l'anima, the wonderful aria she sings at the end of Act 1. It is an aria that contains a number of repetitions. The closing section, Sempre Libera, is a cabaletta, and it is stated twice, but also the cantabile is divided into 2 stanzas with the same music and different poetry. Very often, especially in the past, the second stanza was omitted altogether. It was cut. Today, thankfully, as far as I'm concerned, we tend to do both stanzas. And then there is a question of what do we do with the second one? It is not the kind of music and the kind of accompaniment that really allows for a great deal of ornamentation. You may introduce a turn here and there, or just a small puntatura, but very often with this kind of music, we will tend to believe that the notes that are written down are fine as they are. Then it is important to introduce alterations in the dynamics and the phrasing, so that, for example, the first time, Iam forse lui che l'anima, could become a little bit different when we sing the second stanza. And also in terms of phrasing, there is that wonderful moment that every opera lover knows, where that there is a shift from minor to major, and we hear the wonderful love tune that Alfredo sang to Violetta just a few moments earlier in the duet, and the music goes, Destandomi all'amor, and many singers will do a crescendo on that E natural, and then take a big breath and go into Ah, quell'amor che palpito. What I recommend when I work with sopranos who are learning the role or who are preparing to perform it is that if they do 2 stanzas, the first time they may do what I just described, but the second time, how about singing it all in one breath? Destandomi all'amor, quell'amor che palpito. This is ornamentation too, not in the more literal sense of adding or changing notes, but in the sense of presenting the same musical materials in different ways whenever we hear them more than once. Okay, and this, for me, is at the heart of bringing to life this kind of repertoire. This slide, we don't have the time to go through it in detail. I'll just tell you what it is. In 1858, Rossini was asked to provide ornamentation for Tancredi's recitative for a certain singer by the name of Grégoire, Madame Grégoire. And so here you find that ornamented passage. It is quite wonderful because it shows rhythmic alterations. In particular, at the beginning, we can see that Rossini takes the first three measures, the first three bars of music, and turns them into four by extending the values of dolce e ingrata patria. Rossini writes, "Oh, patria, dolce e ingrata patria." And in the ornamented version that he himself provided, we find this dolce ingrata patria. And notice how the prosodic appoggiaturas are written down in this particular case by the composer. So this is just to show the kind of freedom that we can use in recitatives, not just providing prosodic appoggiaturas, which aren't that free anyway, or embellishments, but also by altering the rhythm. For recitatives in particular, we must remember that the rhythm that is notated is often quite free and formulaic, and it requires singers to think about the meaning of the words and to deliver them in a way that will be clear. First of all, we must understand the words ideally, but also that will be expressive. Let's lean on the words that are truly meaningful. Let's emphasize the dissonances and then move forward in places where all you have is a bunch of performance of this repertoire, means actually to a very considerable extent working with the rhythm of recitatives. And here we have the second page, second slide, with more examples of ornaments provided by Rossini for Madame Grégoire. So, and here I approach my conclusion. I know that it's 10 to 8 already in Italy, where I am, and 10 to 7 for those of us who are in the UK or in other parts of the world where you figure it out. Very often we talk about tuo scritto, as written, so following the letter of what the composer wrote. That is interesting, especially if we have a critical edition where the composer's text has been reconstructed and carefully presented to the performers in a way that makes sense and that gets rid of all of the errors committed by previous publishers, typesetters, engravers, and so on. And yet, then you end up with a reading that can be a little bit dry and lacking in variety, lacking in virtuosity, lacking in expressiveness. Then there is tradition. We have a wealth of traditional approaches to ornamenting bel canto opera. And very often we will hear Rosina's cavatina in Il Barbiere di Siviglia. We will hear Quando rapito in ecstasy from Lucia di Lammermoor. We will hear even Sempre libera from La Traviata. And we have certain standards approaches to ornamentation, standard puntature, standard embellishments, or cadenzas. Those end up becoming another form of, well, tradition, indeed, that's the word we're using, another form of, another way of stabilizing the text. Think of the cadenza, this is not an aria that I mentioned earlier, for Una furtiva lacrima, the marvelous romanza that the tenor Nemorino sings in L'Elisir d'Amore. There is a cadenza that practically every modern tenor sings, and that cadenza is not by Donizetti. It draws on what Donizetti wrote, but it contains some changes, and basically it can be attributed to the tremendous success that Enrico Caruso's recordings of that aria had. So the cadenza is not by Donizetti, so we don't sing it come scritto, but it is standardized, it is enshrined in tradition. The third approach, which is the one that I favor, the one that I will encourage you to pursue and to explore as much as you can as singers, as conductors, as vocal coaches, is creativity. What can we do that is appropriate to encourage performers to sound novel, to surprise us. What can we do with the repeat of a cabaletta, with the repeat of a 4-bar phrase, with a cadenza that will be neither come scritto nor traditional, and that will dazzle the audience and make them not sit back and relax and know exactly what's coming, but rather stay on their toes, so to speak, and really look forward to finding out what the tenor of the day, the soprano of the day, the mezzo-soprano of the day, the bass of the day is going to come up with. Being creative, of course, requires responsibility and requires culture, education. You cannot do just anything, or you can, but the results may not be very successful. But if you study the treatises, if you study what the composers themselves did, and if you get a really good sense of performing traditions that are accounted for in recordings, especially recordings from the very, very, very early 20th century, then you can rediscover some of that creativity that sometimes is squashed nowadays in between the come scritto approach and the traditional approaches to ornamentation. And this is what I wanted to say for today. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you again to Stefano Boccacci for inviting me, and I'm now very happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you, Francesco. It was really fantastic to hear you speak about it. It's a pity that we only have an hour. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. So Chiara Williams, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I think it's kind of already been answered. I was just asking about the kind of well-known trope of going to the opera and seeing the Traviata or something and hearing a cadenza that you've heard before. And I was just wondering about Francesco's opinions on that, but I think...
Yeah, I guess I have answered it to a certain extent. I love it when singers go the extra step or the extra mile sometimes and come up with something truly novel and surprising. With cadenzas, if that's what you're interested in particular, we have to be careful because especially with a composer like Verdi, sometimes you look at the cadenza and it is so beautifully written that it is hard to come up with something that will, how am I going to put it, not surpass it, but something that will really function quite as effectively. I'll give you an example. I cannot sing it from memory, I apologize, but you can look it up yourself. Abigaile's aria in Nabucco. Anch'io rischiuso un giorno. It's a wonderful aria, and at the end it has a cadenza, which is written by Verdi, which contains a chromatic descent. And that chromatic descent actually recalls a passage played by the flute in the introduction to the same aria. It is very clear that Verdi had the intention of introducing that recall as a way of unifying the whole piece. What do you do in a case like that? Do you get rid of that kind of reference that is so effective and so powerful? I don't think so. What you can do, however, is add to a cadenza. If Verdi writes something, you can make it a little bit longer just by adding something before the actual written, the actual notated passage begins, or after, maybe introducing an appoggiatura, maybe going a third or a fourth or a fifth higher, if that's what your voice wants to do, if that's what your voice allows and calls for. These are all possibilities. But before you trash a cadenza written by the composer and come up with a completely new one, you need to have a good reason. I'll tell you one more thing, and this is in praise of come scritto as opposed to tradition. I've identified these two criteria or categories. In Il Trovatore, also by Verdi, Il Conte di Luna, Count Luna sings a magnificent aria in Act 2, Il balen del suo sorriso, and at the end there is a wonderful cadenza that Verdi himself wrote. And then there is a cadenza that most baritones today will sing. The latter goes, sperda il sole un suo sguardo, la tempesta del mio cuor, more or less like that. Now that drives me up the wall. It makes me very angry when I hear that particular cadenza because it's banal. I mean, all of us, you know, if we had a euro, a pound, a dollar, choose your favorite currency. For every time we have heard a cadenza that ends with yam pa tira piram pam pam pam, we'd all be rich. Well, not rich, but we could all go out and have a very nice dinner tonight, for sure. So when you, and if you look at the cadenza that Verdi himself wrote, I won't try to sing it because I'll butcher it, but it is so much more expressive, so much more interesting, so much more surprising that there is no reason to do the traditional one. There is reason to look at the one by Verdi and maybe inflect it, change it, or enrich it a little bit so that we have what Verdi wrote, but we can also make it our own. We can also make it work really well for the voice of a particular baritone. All of this is very important. And then you can be creative and at the same time also faithful, so to speak, to what the composer wrote on the page.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Francesco. Now we have a question by Kotlov. You have your hand raised.
Hi again. I just wanted to ask, outside of the printed text, do we know anything from the writings or the letters of these composers about what their attitude to ornamentation was? Did they love it? Did they regard it as a necessary evil? Did they despair sometimes about what some singers did? Is there anything that they've written outside of the printed text that can give us some clues?
That's a really fantastic question. Already, you know, for this short presentation today, for our conversation, I've drawn on singing treatises, which are not the scores themselves. And you're bringing into the picture a very important body of evidence, which is correspondence. Singers corresponded, composers corresponded with their librettists, with their publishers, with impresarios, and they also corresponded with singers, but they also wrote a lot about singers. And you will find a little bit of everything. You will find, you know, praise of what singers do. Sometimes you will find complaints. Sometimes you will find composers trying to steer singers in a certain direction. Sometimes you will find them giving them complete freedom. There's a great example. I'm going back to the score, actually, so no, I will not give you that example. But letters, I don't even know where to start. Yes, there is an abundance of evidence, and you mentioned the necessary evil, and you also mentioned the praise or the admiration, the approval as categories. Let's remember that this is a system. It's not something that you can accept or reject. It is part of the way in which opera functions, not because it had to be accepted because singers were important and they commanded the highest fees and all of that. Actually, the very way in which this music is designed, formally, structurally, draws on the assumption that singers will do something with it. Because otherwise there is very little point in repeating a cabaletta. Why would you want to do Io sono docile? Well, Io sono docile is a strange example because it's repeated only in part, but Quando rapito in ecstasy from Lucia di Lammermoor, why do it twice if you do it the same way? That's absolutely impossible. It's not the way this music works. So the question is not, you know, whether to do it, the question is how to do it. And yes, sometimes you will find complaints about excess or complaints about the kind of approach the singer will take. More often than not, the complaints that you find are about personality or about lack of technical skills. Singers who don't sing well. You will not really find that many complaints about, oh, you know, that person added too many semiquavers, or that person did a cadenza that was too long or too short. You will find composers guiding certain singers more than others, accepting that some singers will really take over, whereas others may accept the collaboration a little bit more. That's just a short answer, but we could sit here all night and go through examples. Very important for all of us, conductors, singers, stage directors, coaches, to read the letters, to read the correspondence, because there is so much wonderful information. And another body of evidence, of course, is published reviews. We don't have recordings of Tacchinardi Persiani or Maria Malibran or Manuel Garcia Sr. or Giuseppina Streponi or Sofia Leve or any of the great singers of the early and mid-19th century. But we have accounts. We know what they did. We know that sometimes singers began the second statement of a cabaletta much slower than the first statement. And we know that there was universal approval for this, that the audience actually went wild and loved it. So that gives us some guidance too. Thank you for your question.
That's great, Francesco. Oh, we have a lot of questions coming up, so would you mind answering the last?
I'm very happy to stay with you a little bit longer if I don't upset anyone's plans.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a really good question by Antonida. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Francesco. Thank you very much for that talk. It was really interesting. I have quite a specific question. Looking at an aria from Boito's Mephistopheles.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an interesting cadenze, or twice it appears it's a repeat in Margherita's Sax 3 aria,
mm-hmm.
where the cadenza in the vocal line is written as sort of in smaller writing as though it's intended to be played with, but the number of beats in the vocal line just doesn't match up to the number of beats in the orchestral line. There's something like, you know, 4/4 normally, but then suddenly you've got 8. The equivalent of 8 crotchets in the top line. Is there a kind of is there a better or worse approach in terms of whether to sing it a bit slower, a bit faster, to keep it rhythmical within that beat, so it just takes a bit longer, or not?
The short answer is I have no clue. I think you're talking about L'altra notte in fondo al mare.
Yes.
That's the aria you're studying, and I know the piece a little bit, but I haven't looked at the score in years. I don't remember how it's notated. I don't have it. You know, if I were at my home right now, I would have my score. I would go for it, and we would sit at the piano and have a quick look as a starting point. I would have to have a look to give you an answer. So feel free to contact me through social media, and we'll have a look in the coming days. But the question, I will just limit myself to saying that the question you're asking is really important. Precisely because of what I was saying earlier, you know, composers notate things, and to accept that singers give a very important creative input, and that should use their imagination and their freedom, is not to say that they can do whatever they want. You know, we need to allow that written page to guide us, the letter and the intention of the composer, and try to figure it out. Sometimes it's fairly clear, sometimes it's educated guesswork, sometimes we're out into the woods and we just need to try and figure something out, and we will never be completely sure that what we're doing makes any sense whatsoever. That's just life. Let's remember that Boito is a composer who, when he wrote Mephistopheles, was really trying to break away from tradition, and that the cadenzas, so the vocalized passages in L'altra notte in fondo al mare, are very peculiar, very strange, deliberately so. So I would really try to bring out the uniqueness and even the idiosyncratic aspects of his notation. But this is just a very general answer. If we look at the score together, we can have a very different kind of conversation.
Thank you.
Now we have an interesting question by Fleur. Would you like to ask your question?
Hello. I was really interested at the beginning when you were talking about the literary differences between the versi sciolti and the versi lirici. And I was wondering, in kind of a very different example, but Shakespearean prose and Shakespearean verse, and how actors would go about perhaps tackling these differently because of the form of the lines. Would singers have gone at the libretti from a kind of literary standpoint like this? And would there have been maybe a slightly different way of acting these different parts of the operatic number?
Do you mean acting as in visible action, or do you mean acting out in the broader sense of interpreting?
I suppose both.
That's a great question. The quick answer is yes. And we know that they did that because we have descriptions. We have designs and drawings, but we also have reviews and letters that tell us what was going on. Certainly, singers knew about the structure of what they sang, and they knew what was expected at certain key points. They knew about cadenzas, they knew about the repeat of caballettas, but they also knew about the second and third time that the same phrase or nearly the same phrase is heard in a cantabile. They knew what happens when there is a fermata on a note or several notes, and that really indicates not only rhythmic freedom, but to go out on a limb and make it, just come up with flourishes, come up with vocalized passages, and all of that. And the visible action, you know, can certainly accompany that. There is no question that if the text is dramatically more active, that if you're talking about things, if you're pointing at objects, if you're seeing someone who walks in through the door, or maybe through a window, or who rises from the grave, as in Verdi's I Masnadieri, then you will react accordingly. And that's a matter of well, instinct and common sense in a way. It is also a matter of what we see in the stage directions, in the libretti, but also in the scores themselves, in staging notes, such as the staging notes that the librettist for Lucia di Lammermoor left. You know, he left manuscript notes from the staging of the world premiere of Lucia di Lammermoor, 1835. Fascinating document. And then the staging manuals that were prepared in Paris and later on also in Italy. All of these tell us how singers can respond to different situations, so some of them more kinetic, some of them more static, and act them out also visibly. I don't know if this answers your question. It's a huge topic, really, which we could explore forever. But one thing that would be really fascinating is to study whether there were conventions about acting out a cantabile versus acting out a tempo di mezzo. My expectation would be that the cantabile would be much more static, but I may be wrong. Who knows?
Thank you. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Francesco. On that note, next Thursday, we have one of the leading experts on historical acting coming to do a workshop on acting. So
I'll try to connect.
We have Dionysios Kiropoulos doing that. So very pertinent question. And final question from Jesse Martins. You have your...
Jesse, I know Jesse very well. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Francesco. How are you?
Very well. Good to see you. Well, I just see your picture. I don't see you on camera.
Yeah, I'm on my phone. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's absolutely
in researching ornamentation and, particularly now Daughter of the Regiment and the French manuals and different singers who became teachers and wrote about ornamentation and many times wrote their whole cadenze. There's also something that is a time difference, like you're saying, that something that was done at the time for that audience would not be effective nowadays. And how do we help singers, go back to those sources without, with that understanding that, maybe a minute-long cadenza with a lot of virtuosity, for instance, it's a bit too far for nowadays, maybe, and how to tell the difference between what was historically done and this modern take on how to use ornamentation to express the scene and the character and the music, staying within the style of the score.
Wow, well, really big question. Of course, we talk about these things. I'm a scholar, I'm a musicologist, and I write about things for the sake of researching and understanding historical records. But for me, personally, as again, a scholar who is also a musician and who works in the world of opera, the question you're asking is absolutely central. How do we make all of this meaningful for today and for today's artists, for today's voices, for today's audiences, but also for today's performing spaces, venues, or technological media. Of course, we live in a different world and we need to account for that. That should never be forgotten. In a way, when we can go back to the previous categories of letter, intention, and meaning. Those also apply to our understanding and practical use of ornamentation today. When we look at ornamentation that, I don't know, Laure Cinti da Moreau prepared for La Sonnambula, what did she mean to do, and how did she manage to do what she did? And how can we learn from that? How can we draw on that kind of imaginative approach, that kind of virtuosity, that kind of expressive variety, and do it today in a way that will not seem excessive? That's a really big question. When I talk about come scritto, tradition, and creativity, in a way, I'm suggesting that creativity today is squashed, is limited by the two opposite fronts of come scritto and tradition. We go to the opera and we think, oh, well, we should really hear what Verdi wrote, versus we go to the opera and we expect to hear the long cadenza with the flute in Lucia di Lammermoor, even though A, Donizetti wrote no such cadenza, and B, that cadenza is a stylistic absurdity. But if we go to Lucia and the flute cadenza, which was written around 1880, 30 years after the composer had died, if we don't hear it, we feel cheated. We feel that an important bit is missing. Or we feel that, oh, well, the soprano is not good enough. And soprano may do marvelous things throughout the opera, but if they don't do that cadenza, some people will just shrug their shoulders. It's a cruel world. So how do you go about inflecting expectations and venturing into new territory, but without going so far that you will lose the connection with the audience, you will lose the connection with what is acceptable today. My experience, this might surprise you, especially having worked with, well, including at Sarasota Opera, of course, where you were based, but also the Verdi Festival in Parma, and realities where I've not been closely involved myself, but such as the Donizetti Festival in Bergamo or the Rossini Opera Festival in Pesaro, which is, of course, a pioneering project which has really set the standard of what you can do. My experience is that if you do something and you do it well, and you're very explicit about it, the response will be typically more favorable than you might imagine.
Thank you.
That said, it depends on who you're talking to. Right now, having our conversation, there is 50 of us or so connected, and that's all good and well. If we are in the Metropolitan Opera House, it is one story. There will be a certain set of expectations. If we are in an Italian opera house or a German opera house, there may be different expectations. If we are at a festival where people are used to a certain agenda, they become part of it, and then you can bear more. And then you may do it or not do it, but ultimately, if we want this repertoire to survive, we need to be brave with it. We need to be creative, because otherwise, with the proliferation of increasingly sophisticated media, of audiovisual reproduction, where you can watch these incredible performances by the leading singers with the best sets and with the fantastic orchestras, then the live experience will become less and less appealing. That is my fear and my belief. Whereas if we find the courage to do something different each time, then this music will come back to life, really. And we will look forward to every single performance that we are able to attend. There is also this strange break. Now I'm going to go off on a tangent. There's this strange split, this strange hiatus between what we see and what we hear. We know that today we take a lot of freedom with staging opera, and we recontextualize the story. We move it to different locations, to different times, very often to a contemporary setting. And some of us like it, some of us don't, some of us are open-minded, some of us are critical, and that's a very big debate in opera performance today. We don't need to go into it now. But what I tend to say is, okay, we can take L'Elisir d'Amore or Lucia di Lammermoor, we put it on the moon, or we put it at the bottom of the ocean, but then we can't go a little wild with the cadenza. That to me is absurd. And to me, we need to find some kind of level where maybe we rein in some things that happen in staging, in some cases, not all of them, but also let's really accept that performers are creators in this repertoire. Otherwise, the repertoire dies. I'm quite convinced of that. It's not Wagner. But I hope we'll talk about this much more in detail in the future, Jesse.
I hope so too. Thank you, Francesco. This was
Thank you for being here.
Great lecture.
It's a great pleasure to see you here.
Great, Francesco. Thank you very much for this fantastic session. It was really insightful. So,
well, thank you for inviting me. I've certainly enjoyed it, and thanks to you for organizing it, and to everyone who's attended.
We should do our applause.
Pardon? That's very kind. Stefano, are you able to share the PowerPoint presentation with those who were present today?
Yeah, sure. If you send it to me, I'll share it with everyone.
I'll send it to you because there are a couple of final slides which contain recommendations for further reading, and also my email address, just in case people want to contact me. I'm obviously, like everyone, I'm very busy, so I don't always answer right away, but I try to answer to every message that I receive.
Great.
So I'll send you the PowerPoint as soon as we're done talking.
Perfect. Thank you very much.